Right, let's start in Zimbabwe, where Thursday has been declared a public holiday, primarily in order to allow ZANU-PF supporters to attend the swearing-in ceremony of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe's capital, Harare. The ceremony is being held in a 60,000-seater sports stadium, and that ceremony had been delayed after the opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai, who's boycotting the event, filed a court petition alleging widespread electoral fraud. However, Mugabe's victory was endorsed by the country's constitutional court, which in turn declared the elections were free, fair and credible, as well as the regional bloc SADC, which had more or less the same sentiment. Now, some 40 heads of state and government were invited, and former leaders of Tanzania, Botswana, Mozambique, Namibia and Zambia are thought to be attending the ceremony. Once Mugabe has been sworn in, he will begin a new 5-year term in office. Let's make a quick run and take a look at the man that is Robert Gabriel Mugabe. He spent 10 years in prison for what is being described as subversion in the 1960s under white minority rule. He became a symbol of African independence from European colonial regimes when his ZANU-PF party swept to power in Zimbabwe's first free elections in 1980. Mugabe then stated that his first priorities at that time were education, health and the development of democracy. Mugabe served as Zimbabwe's first post-independence prime minister between 1980 and 1987, and he has held office as president ever since. However, over the last 10 years, Zimbabwe has suffered from a combination of hyperinflation, food shortages and heavily disputed and violent elections, like the one in 2008, which led to a tense coalition with the opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai of the MDC. At 89 years of age, he is now Africa's oldest president and one of the longest serving in power. Right, let's get the latest details here on Mugabe's inauguration. We'll be taking you live to London, where Dan Whitehead is standing by. Dan, thank you very much for your time here. The EU and the US, of course, do still have the sanctions in place on Zimbabwe. So essentially, should we continue to look for more of the same policy as far as the West is concerned with regard to Zimbabwe?
I think for the foreseeable future, we are going to see a separated and distant relationship between Zimbabwe and the West as a whole. As you mentioned, these sanctions are still in place. Foreign ministers, EU foreign ministers met in Brussels on Wednesday. It is there that they decided to maintain the sanctions for another 6 months. That takes it to February 2014. The specific stance on the sanctions from the UK is that it is a decision for all EU member states, so it will stand by Wednesday's decision. Washington taking a slightly harder line, citing that it categorically will not remove its own sanctions, and any change will be down to a peaceful reform in Zimbabwe, both in the electoral process and relations with the West. That's not something that looks like it's going to be happening in the foreseeable future. Mugabe, of course, blaming these sanctions on the economic situation in the country.
Therefore, Dan, would it essentially be correct to argue that the West is highly unlikely to change its tune over the next 5 years and fund in any way, shape or form Zimbabwe's economic recovery, despite appeals to do so by, say, the African Development Bank or the Southern African Development Community?
I think you're right. I think the current status, and depending on what government Robert Mugabe sets forward when he announces his cabinet and so forth, I don't think there is going to be any change. I do have here a copy of a statement from the Foreign Secretary William Hague, which was released in the last few hours. In it, he describes his grave concern at the withdrawal of the legal challenge by Morgan Tsvangirai, but also more generally, it's the old rhetoric, really. International community supports the people of Zimbabwe for their democratic rights, for a free, peaceful and prosperous future. We've heard it all before, so I don't think there's any major change coming from the political basis in the UK or Washington unless we see the same change coming from Mugabe's camp.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. That's Dan Whitehead over in London, giving us the latest reactions, of course, to the fact that one Robert Gabriel Mugabe will certainly be in power, looking forward to relations with the West over the next 5 years. Time for a short break here on Africa Live. Here's what's coming up next. Liberty beckons. Egyptians are anxious about the release of their former president, Hosni Mubarak. And Wildlife Conservation will be telling you what Kenyan authorities are doing to combat poaching on their territory.
the latest trends in global politics, economics, culture and sport, and how Africa fits into the global picture. You decide what's important.
We need a trade justice.
Africa's future will be determined by Africa.
For women's equal opportunity, for a better life.
We have to change something, and it's not the outsiders.
Talk Africa, a new voice for the world.
Welcome back. The deposed Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak could leave prison on Thursday after a court ruling to that effect, and that potentially can further divide this country, which is in turmoil ever since the army toppled the Islamist president Mohamed Morsi 7 weeks ago. Convening at the Cairo prison where Mubarak is being held, the court ordered the release of the military man who ruled Egypt for over 30 years until he was overthrown during the popular uprisings that swept the Arab world in early 2011. The Prime Minister's office said he would be placed under house arrest after his release. Now, this is being interpreted by many in Egypt as an attempt to placate many who will object to the release of a man who they held mass protests to eject from power 2 years ago. Citing a security force, the state news agency said Mubarak would most likely be transported to one of the state's vital installations or one of 2 military hospitals where he will be under heavy guard. A court accepted his appeal earlier this year and ordered his retrial. The ailing former Air Force pilot probably has absolutely no political future to speak of, but the court ruling has made some Egyptians quite uncomfortable. Now, news of former President Hosni Mubarak's impending release has been met with different reactions from Egyptians on the streets. Take a look.
I have no issues with this. He turned out to be better than Morsi. Morsi made more mistakes in 1 year than Mubarak in 30 years in power. I don't expect tensions in the streets when he is freed.
Justice decides his fate, and we should respect the court whether he is guilty or innocent. I'm glad he'll be placed under house arrest. This means he'll not try to get back to power.
This is wrong. If I steal £1 to feed my children, I will be jailed. He admitted that he stole millions. Therefore, he must be severely punished. He should be treated like us normal citizens. He's not a president anymore.
Now, as the Kenyan President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta concludes his visit to China, one of the issues accomplished on his agenda was the protection of Kenya's precious wildlife. Part of the $5 billion agreement signed between the two countries will be going directly towards funding wildlife protection efforts on both sides. Now, that agreement is especially timely because hundreds of elephants and rhinos have been brutally slaughtered in Kenya in recent months. And as the poachers are growing more and more sophisticated, wildlife officials in Kenya stepping up their efforts to curb the vice, as CCTV's Maria Galang now explains.
Nairobi National Park, a haven for wildlife just 7 kilometers from the center of Kenya's capital, and one of the best protected conservation sites in Africa. Yet earlier this month, poachers masquerading as tourists calmly drove in here and found their target, a white rhino. They shot it dead before carving out its horn and then drove out again undetected. It's the first such killing in the park in 6 years, and it's shocked officials here. But it's put the spotlight on a growing menace in Kenya. So far this year, 200 elephants across Kenya have been killed for their ivory and 35 rhino for their horns. The national park killing has prompted Kenya Wildlife Service to review its anti-poaching strategies.
When our men are doing ground patrols, we offer them aerial cover because we got an air wing with several aircrafts, and we give them that backing, and that ensures that we are able to cover bigger ground, because even the aerial surveillance alone is able to tell us whether we have illegal activity inside our protected areas or not.
The KWS is also using tracking devices.
For rhinos and elephants, we have been using radio transmitters on them. For elephants, we have collars, and of course for rhinos, we have mechanisms that we apply these transmitters so that we can be able to tell where some of these animals are at any one point.
But the rangers face a very cunning, often murderous opponent. Previously, many poachers would cross from Somalia on foot and hunt in Tsavo East and Meru National Parks. Recently, they've begun using 4x4 vehicles, motorcycles and high-caliber weapons. Many have an army background.
We are strengthening our rules and our laws against poaching, because this is another area that hadn't really been looked at. So we're increasing the fines, jail sentences for people caught poaching.
President Uhuru Kenyatta has identified poaching as one of the biggest challenges facing Kenya. But it isn't a new problem. Kenya has struggled to increase the population of rhino and elephant for decades. In 1970, the population of elephants in Kenya stood at around 165,000. Now, this number dropped significantly in 1989 to 16,000 elephants. This pile of ashes are the remains of 12 tons of ivory that former Kenya President Daniel Arap Moi burnt back in 1989. Over the years, however, the number has over doubled to 38,000 elephants. Legislation is coming that will mean 15-year jail sentences for poaching. But officials say the reality is the killing will continue as long as there's demand from buyers in the Far East. Maria Galang, CCTV, Nairobi.
Now, as we mentioned earlier on in the bulletin, Thursday has been declared a public holiday in Zimbabwe, primarily for one particular event, the inauguration of one of Africa's longest-serving leaders as president of that country following the elections held on the 31st of July, Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Let's get some analysis and reactions on the ground. CCTV's Farai Mukutu joins us now from the capital, Harare. We're also joined by Catherine Grant from South Africa's Institute of International Affairs. Thank you both for your time this afternoon. Farai, let's start with you. What's the atmosphere like in Harare right now? It does seem, of course, that we're having problems there with Farai. Catherine, however, Catherine Grant, as I said earlier, is with the South African Institute of International Affairs. Catherine, looking ahead, how is Mugabe's presidency likely to be received in the region, especially by members of the Southern African Development Community?
There's been a very warm reception from the Southern African Development Community to the re-election of President Mugabe. We saw very warm congratulatory messages coming from at least 13 of the heads of state from SADC, the exception being Botswana. And of course, over the weekend at the SADC summit in Malawi, President Mugabe was elected to chair SADC from August 2014 onwards.
Indeed, but we do understand that President Jacob Zuma of South Africa is not attending that inauguration. How is that likely to be interpreted in South Africa and Zimbabwe as well?
Yes, this is a very interesting development. The announcement was made yesterday that South Africa would be represented at the inauguration by the Deputy President and that President Zuma would be keeping his earlier commitments to make an engagement in Durban, where he'll be addressing South African trade unions, as we understand. This is quite an interesting move on the part of South Africa. I think it will be interpreted by some as a snub directly to President Mugabe, but it's a little bit inconsistent because Jacob Zuma was one of the first African leaders to actually congratulate President Mugabe in very effusive terms. So it's slightly mixed messaging coming out of South Africa at the moment.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that. Catherine Grant from the South African Institute of International Affairs on the mixed signals coming straight out of South Africa. The president, of course, Jacob Zuma, not attending the inauguration of Robert Mugabe as president in the Zimbabwean capital, Harare, right now. We'll have more details on that for you at 1700 GMT. Right now, though, let's move on across the seas. The trial for one of China's highest profile corruption cases is underway. Bo Xilai, former Communist Party chief of Chongqing municipality, is facing charges of bribery, embezzlement and abuse of power. Our reporter Han Bin reports from the media briefing at the Jinan Intermediate People's Court.
The long-awaited trial is about to begin. The crowds indicate the level of public interest. The media arrive hours in advance to get any bit of information. Bo Xilai, who once championed his own sweeping local anti-corruption campaign, now faces charges of bribery, graft, and abuse of power.
收受上述二人给予的财物共计折合
From 1999 to 2012, during his positions as mayor of Dalian, governor of Liaoning, and minister of commerce, Bo Xilai took huge amounts of bribes worth some 21 million yuan and 5 million yuan in embezzlement. He used his power to cover up his wife's murder case during his term as party chief in Chongqing.
公款人民币500万元。
Media coverage has been relentless, and in a move towards greater transparency, the People's Intermediate Court is giving updates on the proceedings on its microblog account, China's version of Twitter. It's part of an open trial, which means making information publicly available. Professor He Jiahong from the Law School of Renmin University says the open trial is a basic principle.
According to our criminal procedure law, all criminal cases should be tried openly to the public. So I think that for the high-ranking public officials, the open trial is a common practice.
He Jiahong thinks people should not expect any surprises from the proceedings. He explained the priorities of the Chinese legal system, which stresses evidence over argument.
I think that in Bo Xilai's trial, conviction is certain. There is no doubt about that. Because, you know, in criminal proceedings, China has a tradition to give more attention to the stage of investigation. In other words, the trial stage in China is not very significant.
An open trial usually lasts 1 or 2 days, and the crowds outside are likely to grow as they and the country wait to hear the fate of Bo Xilai.
With the opening of the trial of Bo Xilai, the dramatic case that shocked China will be resolved in court. It's both a test for the former Chinese politician himself and China's legal system. The proceedings will send strong signals of how the Chinese government deals with corruption. Whatever the sentence, whatever the verdict, Bo Xilai's case will be talked about for a very long time. Han Bin, CCTV in Jinan of Shandong province.
20 minutes into the hour, it's time for an update on what's happening in the business world.